All right, we're here at TopVelocity.net with Stephen Godani, and this is the @TopVelocity hashtag pitching tips show, I guess we're going to say. So this is where we've been answering your questions about pitching or position players, anything around our programs, our 3X, 2X programs. So let's just get right to it. So Stephen, what's our question for the show?
Joe Martins asked, we know thoughts on how to create triple extension and front leg stabilization, but what should be happening to hips and legs at layback and ball release?
Okay, so this is at external rotation and ball release, what's happening to the hips and legs, okay? Yep. So that is important because pretty much all the key dynamics happen at front foot strike. Yeah, there's a lot of important things that we have to do to get there, but at front foot strike, there's the speeds and everything that's going to be driving a high velocity pitch is going to come from the ground up, and it's critical to all the little intricacies of what's going on in the body. So I think the first thing we'll talk about in the front leg has to be going into some type of extension, but more importantly, first stabilization. So meaning when I hit front foot strike, that front leg cannot move. It has to stay stable. Okay, and then, because there's many studies that show, probably some of the studies that come from the lower body and its correlation to ball speed, shows that the pitcher will actually extend the leg back into pitch release. So you'll actually see the leg extending, and most importantly, it needs to be extending in a linear direction, meaning back towards the hips, not up in a vertical direction. So we want to see not just extension, but linear extension moving back into the hips. That would be critical, and at the same time too, we want to see hip rotation fully opening in that point. But they do kind of go hand in hand, because you'll get the question, how do I get better front leg extension? And a lot of it can come from just better hip rotation. So just look at it this way. If I'm going into front foot strike, before I go into front foot strike, we should have already started the back leg drive and internal rotation. That's something we're not going to cover here. So that means the hips are starting to actually open as I go into front foot strike. That is critical. It must happen. A lot of coaches out there will say that you land and then rotate your hips. Yeah, you are rotating your hips after you land, but the rotation should have already begun, and that's critical. So the rotation has begun. Now as I hit front foot strike with that rotation, there is a force from my back leg drive pushing, say for a righty, the right hip forward, and because the front leg is stabilized, that's a force, and then there's a force that should be pushing the left hip back. That's going to support rotation. Okay, so both of those forces, which we call 3X and 2X drives, part of the 3X pitching velocity program. 3X is triple extension of the back leg. 2X is the ankle and knee extension of the front leg. That's supporting the rotation of the hips if timed correctly. But how it supports the extension of the knee is because the hips are rotating in that process, that, like I said, that front hip or left hip for a righty is actually moving backwards as the forces from the front hip is pushing around. So in its process of moving backwards, the knee is extending, but of course they're all working hand in hand. The extension and drive of the front leg pushing the front hip back, the initial drive of the back leg pushing the back hip forward, the hips rotating, working also with the extension of the front leg. So a lot of times, if you're going into front foot strike and you're trying to extend that leg and you just feel like either you don't have the strength or it's just not happening, sometimes it's because your hips aren't even moving. You're a guy who's locked up, you don't have good mobility, so if you don't have enough force driving your hips through, then they stick on you and you'll hit front foot and your hips just stick and lock, so there is no rotation going on. So yeah, now you're pushing against a force that's not moving. It's going to be impossible for you to extend that front leg. So it really helps if you go down that road in two different directions. You go down the road of working on hip rotation, and then you go down the road of working on front leg stabilization and extension. And if you can do them together simultaneously, you typically get the effect that we're looking for, which is good stabilization and hip rotation to then drive trunk rotation. Be complicated.
And trunk tilt too, right?
And trunk tilt.
It gets the trunk tilt, that's what's going to get that layback and then into ball release too.
Okay, so once the shoulders start to rotate, we want to make sure that we have a lot of linear force moving us forward. We don't want to just be rotational guys because there's a lot of ball speed behind linear movements. So if we have in the trunk rotation, if we had some initial good linear power through a 3X drive, then that should, after we did everything we just talked about at the hips, with the good hip rotation, front leg extension, as the trunk rotation occurs, the body should want to then transfer all that linear energy initially from the delivery, and then that's what helps load and lay back the arm. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, it does sound very complicated, but that's actually the process of what's occurring. So just to recap, you will have a better dynamics of hip rotation and front leg extension stabilization if they work together. They cannot work against each other. So they have to work together.
And they should be fully open at the time he's talking about layback and ball release. So by the time that he's in the layback and ball release, your leg should be done, right? It should be, the energy should have all been transferred.
Right. At the point of layback, this, they call it the hip pelvic complex should be stable. Boom, everything's locked down. And then you're going into shoulder rotation, external rotation. Yeah, this should be done and stable and locked down.
Moving forward.
Yeah. If this is still moving while you're going into trunk rotation, trunk tilt, external rotation, you're not transferring accelerating energy efficiently. So you're right. That has to interact. The hips have to open. The front leg has to stabilize. It has to extend back, and it has to do it quick enough so when the shoulders go, it's done and it's stable. So the shoulders can now go. So that's the timing aspect. And to tell you the truth, that's the elite aspects of the whole delivery. And that's why speed and power is so important to be in a high velocity pitcher, because the faster you want to throw, the quicker and the more dynamic that has to occur to support the trunk and then the arms. All right, so that's a good enough question for this episode. We're going to put out another episode with another question. So if you have any questions out there that you'd like us to answer, just go to Twitter, put, of course, out to us, TopVelocity, or at Stephen O'Godani, #pitching tips, and we want to answer your question. So appreciate you watching, and get ready for the next episode.
Work hard, play hard, work hard, play hard, work hard, play hard, work hard, play hard.